Daniel settled his daughter Sophie into her seat first, buckling her in carefully before turning to his own. She pressed her face against the window, completely captivated by the ground crew moving below. She narrated their every move in a soft, curious stream of words. Daniel listened with a smile, feeling the tension in his body finally start to ease. The first-class cabin felt like a different world altogether. Conversations were hushed, glasses clinked softly, and the only other sound was the rustle of newspapers. No crying babies. No cramped knees pressed against the seat in front. No need to apologize for simply existing. He was keenly aware that he didn't look like the other first-class passengers. His jacket was worn, his shoes were practical, not fashionable. The faint shadows under his eyes were a permanent fixture, a testament to a kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. But he knew, deep down, that he belonged here today. He had earned this one moment of peace, if nothing else. Sophie turned from the window, her voice gentle. "Did Mommy ever fly on a plane like this?" The question was innocent, but it landed with a sharp sting. Daniel swallowed hard. "She flew on planes," he said, choosing his words with care. "But she would have loved this one." Sophie nodded, satisfied with the answer, and turned her attention back to the bustling world outside. As the last passengers boarded, an unfamiliar feeling washed over Daniel. It was relief. Not quite joy, but a loosening of the constant, heavy vigilance that had become his normal state of being. He leaned his head back against the plush seat, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and took a deep, slow breath. That was when a shadow fell over them. "Excuse me." Daniel opened his eyes. A flight attendant stood in the aisle beside their row. She looked immaculate, a perfectly pressed uniform, not a single hair out of place, and a smile that seemed more a product of training than genuine warmth. Her name badge read Megan. "Yes?" Daniel replied. She glanced down at a tablet in her hand. Then at Sophie, and then her eyes landed back on him. "There appears to be an issue. These seats are designated for first-class passengers." Daniel felt a slight frown form. "Yes, that's us." Megan's professional smile tightened. "Sir, these seats are not suitable for children. You'll need to move to economy." The words hit him harder than he expected. "I'm sorry," he said, keeping his voice calm. "My ticket was upgraded by the airline." Megan shook her head, a flicker of disbelief in her eyes. "That's highly unlikely." Sophie looked up at him, her small face clouded with confusion. "Daddy?" Daniel placed a reassuring hand over hers. "It's okay, sweetie," but it wasn't. It was far from okay. The flight attendant's tone cooled even further. "Other passengers have paid for a quiet experience. I'll need you to gather your belongings now." A few heads in the nearby rows turned to look. The spacious cabin suddenly felt small and suffocating. Daniel felt that old, familiar burn rise in his chest, the sting of being judged, of being dismissed, of being reduced to a stereotype before he even had a chance. He could argue. He could raise his voice and make a scene. But Sophie was watching him, her wide eyes taking everything in. "Please just check the passenger manifest," he said, his voice steady and even. Megan let out a sigh, her impatience now clearly visible. "Sir, if you don't comply, I'm going to have to involve security." That single word security changed everything. Daniel was a man who knew which battles weren't worth fighting, especially with his daughter as his audience. Slowly, his movements heavy, he reached over and unbuckled Sophie's seatbelt. "We're okay," he whispered to her, even as his own chest tightened with a crushing weight. As he stood up, a wave of humiliation washed over him, not for being moved, but for the silent lesson this was teaching his child about their place in the world. They stepped into the aisle, ready to make the walk of shame back to economy. And then a firm voice cut through the quiet cabin. "Stop!" The word carried weight, authority without volume, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to be obeyed. Megan froze mid-gesture, her hand still pointing accusingly. Across the aisle, a man was standing up from his seat. He was unassuming, dressed in simple, casual clothes, no tailored suit, no flashy watch, no visible status symbols that screamed important. Yet there was something about his posture, the quiet confidence in his stance that commanded attention from everyone around. He looked directly at Megan, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. What's the issue here? He asked, his voice calm and even. Megan straightened up, trying to regain her composure and professional demeanor. This passenger, she said, gesturing toward Daniel, is seated incorrectly. He's in the wrong class. The man then turned his attention to Daniel. His gaze softened slightly as he saw the young boy beside him, clutching a small toy airplane. May I see your boarding pass, sir? He asked politely. Daniel hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of so much unwanted attention. He fumbled in his pocket, then handed the flimsy paper over. The man took it and scanned the details. A slight, almost imperceptible curve touched the corner of his mouth. He looked up, first at Daniel, then back at Megan. Seats 2A and 2B, he stated clearly. First class. Megan's face flushed a deep, embarrassed red. There must be some mistake, she stammered, her voice losing its earlier conviction. The system must be— There isn't a mistake, the man interrupted her calmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Because I'm the airline's director of customer experience. The air in the first-class cabin shifted dramatically. You could feel the tension change. Passengers who had been minding their own business were now leaning in, their curiosity piqued. Megan's confident facade collapsed instantly, like a building giving way. She stood there, frozen, her authority gone. Daniel said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply pulled his son a little closer, a silent act of protection and reassurance. The director had taken control of the situation completely. He turned his full attention back to Megan, his voice still quiet but now carrying a sharp edge. You assumed he didn't belong here. Why? Silence. The entire cabin was quiet, waiting for her answer. Megan looked down at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. You embarrassed him in front of his child? The director continued, his words precise and cutting. You publicly questioned his integrity based on nothing more than his appearance. Explain. Megan's hands began to tremble. I thought, she began, her voice barely a whisper. You thought wrong, the director finished for her. The cabin was now so silent you could hear a pin drop. Every assumption, every prejudice, every lesson in customer service that had been ignored was now laid bare for all to see. The weight of her mistake hung heavily in the air. And then Megan did something that no one, least of all the director, expected. She took a step forward, closing the small distance between her and Daniel's seat. And she knelt. She knelt on the plush carpet of the first-class aisle, her head bowed. The gesture was one of complete and utter humility. Sir, she said, her voice thick with emotion, looking up at Daniel, I am so sorry. There is no excuse for my behavior. I judged you, and I was wrong. I deeply apologize for the disrespect I showed you and your son. Daniel looked surprised, his own anger and embarrassment momentarily forgotten. He looked from the kneeling flight attendant to the director, who watched the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. The director let the moment hang in the air before speaking. He addressed Megan, his tone softer now. Get up! Megan slowly rose to her feet, her eyes still fixed on Daniel. An apology is a start, the director said. But actions are what matter. How will you ensure this never happens again? Megan took a deep breath. I will re-examine my own biases. I will remember that every passenger, regardless of who they are or what they look like, deserves respect. I will treat this as the most important lesson of my career. The director nodded slowly. He then turned to Daniel. Sir, on behalf of the airline, I want to extend our sincerest apologies. This is not the standard of service we strive for. Your flight and your next one with us will be complimentary. We would also like to offer your son a tour of the cockpit with the captain once we've landed, if he'd like. The little boy's eyes lit up at the mention of the cockpit, a genuine smile breaking through the tension. Daniel looked at his son, then back at the director, and finally at Megan. He saw the genuine remorse in her eyes. Thank you, he said quietly. I accept your apology. The situation was resolved. Passengers settled back into their seats, the quiet hum of the cabin returning. Megan gave a final, respectful nod to Daniel before discreetly moving back to the galley, her face a mixture of shame and relief. The director returned to his seat, but before he sat down, he made eye contact with Daniel one last time. Enjoy your flight, he said with a small, genuine smile. As the plane began its ascent, Daniel looked out the window, his son now happily chatting about meeting the pilot. The incident had been humiliating, but it had also ended in a way he never could have predicted. It was a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound lessons don't come from a textbook or a training manual, but from a moment of public failure and the unexpected grace of a sincere apology. A moment of judgment in the aisle had turned into a lesson in humility for everyone involved. 30,000 feet in the air, the world below shrinks to a patchwork of green and brown, and inside the pressurized cabin, a different kind of world takes shape. For Daniel and his 7-year-old daughter Sophie, this flight was supposed to be an adventure, the start of a vacation. Sophie, a whirlwind of energy and questions, was practically vibrating with excitement in her seat, her nose pressed against the small oval window. But adventures, as we know, rarely go according to plan. The trouble started subtly, as it often does. A dropped crayon rolling under the seat in front. A burst of giggles a little too loud during the safety demonstration. A whispered, but not quite whispered, question about why the lady in the next aisle had such funny-looking shoes. Daniel, ever the patient father, was in a constant state of gentle correction. "Sophie, honey," inside voice, "let's try to keep our feet off the seat in front. Remember what we talked about? Personal space." Each admonition was met with a temporary nod of understanding, followed swiftly by another small, innocent transgression. Then came the snack service. For Sophie, this was the main event. Her eyes widened as the flight attendant, a woman named Megan with a tired but professional smile, wheeled the cart down the aisle. "Can I have the pretzels and the juice, please, Daddy?" Sophie begged, her voice climbing in pitch and volume. Daniel agreed, and as Megan handed over the small packet of pretzels and a plastic cup of orange juice, Sophie's excitement bubbled over. In her haste to grab the cup, her elbow knocked it, sending a cascade of sticky orange liquid splashing onto the crisp white shirt of the businessman in the seat ahead of them. A sharp, angry hiss cut through the cabin's low hum. The man, whose name they would later learn was Mr. Harrison, twisted in his seat, his face a mask of fury. Daniel's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and apology. "I am so sorry," he began, pulling a wad of napkins from his pocket. It was a complete accident. Sophie, who had frozen at the man's outburst, suddenly burst into tears. Not quiet sniffles, but great, gulping sobs of shock and shame. The businessman sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes. "Fantastic, just fantastic," he muttered, turning back around. Megan, the flight attendant, offered the man some club soda and napkins, her expression unreadable. Annoyance? It was a professional blankness that offered no comfort. Daniel wrapped his arms around his sobbing daughter. "It's okay, sweetheart, it's okay." "It was an accident," he whispered, trying to soothe her. But the damage was done. The cabin, which had been filled with a neutral, ambient noise, now felt suffocatingly silent. Every cough, every rustle of a magazine seemed amplified. Daniel could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on them. He felt the judgment, the unspoken, "Why dash can single quotes, de dash he dash keep dash case, dash kid dash" from the seats around them. Sophie's sobs eventually quieted into hiccups, her small body trembling in his arms. She buried her face in his shirt, refusing to look at anyone. The adventure had curdled into a nightmare. Not a peaceful quiet, but a tense, heavy one. Daniel felt like he and Sophie were on a tiny, isolated island of shame. He tried to interest her in her coloring book, in the cartoons on the seatback screen, but she just shook her head, her lower lip still quivering. But then something shifted. It started with the woman across the aisle. She'd been reading a book, seemingly oblivious. She didn't say a word. She just gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod and a soft, understanding smile. It was a silent message. "I see you. It's okay." "I get it." He felt a knot of tension in his chest, loosened just a little. He nodded back, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. A few minutes later, an older gentleman in the row behind them leaned forward. He didn't speak to Daniel directly. He just raised his plastic cup of water in a quiet, miniature toast, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a kind way before he turned his attention back to the window. It wasn't a conversation, it wasn't an intervention, but it was support. It was a silent chorus of, "We're with you." Then Megan, the flight attendant, returned. Daniel braced himself, expecting another coolly professional interaction or perhaps a warning to keep Sophie quiet. But this time was different. Megan wasn't holding a drink or a trash bag. In her hand, she held a single chocolate chip cookie saved from the snack service. "Hey there," she said, her voice soft and warm, completely different from her earlier tired professionalism. Sophie peeked out from behind Daniel's arm, her eyes wide and still watery. The flight attendant's smile wasn't a forced customer service smile anymore. It was genuine. It was kind. Sophie slowly, tentatively, reached out and took the cookie. Megan didn't rush off. "Airplanes can be tough sometimes, huh?" she said softly, just to Sophie. "But you're doing a great job." Daniel watched the entire exchange, his heart swelling. He saw the shift in Megan's demeanor, the deliberate act of kindness. The anger on his face had been replaced by something else, a flicker of contemplation, maybe even a hint of regret. He saw the collective tension in the cabin dissolve, replaced by a quiet, shared humanity. It was about awareness. It was about one person, the woman with the smile, choosing empathy, and that choice rippling outwards. Megan's simple act of kneeling, of offering a cookie, had completely rewritten the story of their flight. It was a masterclass in compassion. As Megan stood up and continued down the aisle, the atmosphere was transformed. The air felt lighter. Sophie took a small bite of the cookie, her mood visibly lifting. He smoothed Sophie's hair, his own voice soft. "Yes, she is," he said. "Sometimes people just need a moment to learn. And sometimes they teach the rest of us too." The rest of the flight was peaceful. Sophie finished her cookie and even managed a small, sleepy smile. The world outside was still just a blur of clouds, but inside that small metal tube, a small community had been forged through silent nods and a single act of kindness. Daniel realized this flight wasn't just a means to a vacation. It was a destination in itself. A lesson learned at 30,000 feet, that in the midst of embarrassment and anger, a little bit of grace can change everything. It's a reminder that we are all just traveling together, and the best we can do is offer each other a little understanding, and maybe a cookie. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more tales about the little moments that make a big difference. Have you ever felt like the world was judging you, putting you in a box you didn't choose? I want to tell you a story today, a story about a man named Daniel and his little girl Sophie. It's a story that starts with a simple flight, but it's really about something much bigger: dignity, kindness, and what it truly means to win in life. It all began on a crowded airplane. Daniel, just a regular dad trying to make his daughter comfortable, found himself in a difficult situation. He had paid for premium seats, a little splurge to make a long trip easier for Sophie, but an airline error had double-booked them. Standing there with Sophie's small hand in his was a well-known director, a man used to getting his way. The director's assistant was firm, almost demanding that Daniel and Sophie move to standard economy seats. You can imagine the scene, right? The stares from other passengers, the flight attendant's strained smile, The pressure to just give in and avoid a scene. It's that sinking feeling in your stomach, that voice that tells you to just keep the peace. Daniel felt it. He looked at the director, a man of power and influence, and then down at his daughter, whose world was just this airplane, this moment. What would you do? Argue? Make a fuss? Demand what's rightfully yours. It's tempting. Our sense of justice screams for it, but Daniel chose a different path. He looked at the stressed flight attendant, at the impatient passengers, and at the famous director who seemed oblivious to the ripple effect of his demands. And Daniel made a choice, not out of weakness, but out of a deep, quiet strength. He knelt down to Sophie's level, so their eyes met. He whispered, "Sweetheart, we're going to play a game. It's called the adventure game. We're going to sit in some different seats, and it'll be our secret mission." Sophie's eyes, wide with confusion just a moment before, now lit up with excitement. A game, a secret mission. For a child, that transforms everything. With a simple, calm nod, Daniel agreed to move. He gathered their things, held Sophie's hand, and walked down the aisle to the new seats. No drama, no angry words, just a quiet acceptance. Some might see this as defeat. They might say he should have fought for his rights, that he let himself be walked all over. And maybe a part of Daniel felt that sting of injustice. But he was playing a long game, teaching a lesson that no premium seat could ever offer. As they settled into the smaller economy seats, Sophie wasn't upset. She was on an adventure. Daniel pulled out her favorite coloring book and a small bag of gummy bears he'd packed, just in case. They were a team. He realized something profound in that moment. His reaction was the only thing he could truly control. He couldn't control the airline's mistake or the director's entitlement, but he could control how he responded, and more importantly, what his daughter witnessed. He chose not to teach her that the world is a battle to be won at all costs. Instead, he showed her how to navigate unfairness with grace. He showed her that you can stand your ground on what matters, your own integrity, without needing to win every single skirmish. Dignity, he was learning, wasn't about the seat you occupy. It was about the character you display. The flight continued. Sophie napped, her head resting on his lap. Daniel had time to think. He wasn't a celebrity, he was just a dad. But in that small, cramped space, he felt a sense of peace. He hadn't surrendered, he had chosen. He had protected his daughter's peace, and in doing so, he had protected his own. He thought about how often we fight battles that don't really matter. Fueled by ego and a desire to be proven right, we want the better seat, the last word, the public apology. But what if the real victory is walking away with your peace of mind and your kindness intact? Later in the flight, the director walked down the aisle. He paused by Daniel's seat. There was a moment of silence. You could feel the unspoken words hanging in the air. The director, perhaps having observed Daniel's quiet composure, perhaps reflecting on his own actions, leaned in. "I just wanted to say," he started, his voice much softer now, "thank you for your grace." It wasn't a full-blown apology, but it was an acknowledgement, a moment of human connection. Daniel simply nodded. He didn't need more. He didn't need to say, "I told you so," or "you were wrong." He just said, "Thank you for seeing us." It was a powerful exchange. Seeing us, not just as seat fillers, but as people. A father and a daughter on a journey. In that moment, the gap between the famous director and the ordinary dad vanished. They were just two people. As the plane began its descent, Daniel felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The city lights twinkled below, a beautiful, sprawling galaxy. Sophie, awake now, pressed her face against the window, her breath fogging the cool glass. She turned to him, her expression serious, and asked a question that went straight to his heart. "Daddy," she said, "did we win?" What a question. How do you explain the complexities of human interaction to a child? How do you define winning? Is it getting what you want? Is it being right? Daniel looked at her innocent, questioning face, and he smiled. A true, genuine smile. "No, sweetheart," he answered softly. "We learned, and isn't that the most important victory of all? Not winning the argument, but learning something valuable. Learning how to handle disappointment. Learning how to choose your battles. Learning that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to act with quiet dignity and kindness, even when others don't." When they finally landed and walked into the bustling terminal, Daniel was just another face in the crowd. Another tired father holding his daughter's small hand. On the outside, nothing had changed. He wasn't in a premium seat. He didn't get an upgrade or a voucher. But on the inside, something fundamental had shifted. He understood now. Dignity wasn't about status or special treatment. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about standing firm in your values without becoming hard and cynical. It was about holding on to your self-respect while still showing kindness to others. It was about teaching his daughter that her worth is not determined by where she sits, but by how she carries herself. It's about showing a child how to be kind without letting people take advantage of you, a delicate and crucial balance. As they walked through the airport surrounded by the rush and noise of 1,000 different journeys, Daniel squeezed Sophie's hand. He felt her small hand squeeze back. They weren't just walking away from a flight. They were walking forward into their lives, together, with a lesson learned, a bond strengthened, and a quiet, unshakable dignity that no one could ever take away from them. This story really stuck with me. It's a reminder that in our daily lives, we're constantly faced with these little moments, these airplane situations. And our choices in those moments define us. They teach the people around us, especially our children, what we truly value. So, next time you feel that spark of injustice, maybe take a breath and ask yourself, do I need to win or do I need to learn? Thanks so much for listening. If this story resonated with you, I'd love it if you hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the little moments that make life big. See you in the next one. Daniel Harper woke before the alarm the way he always did. Years of interrupted sleep had trained his body to rise at the faintest hint of dawn, even when rest still clung to him like a heavy coat. The hotel room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the slow, even breathing of his daughter. Sophie lay curled on the other bed, one arm flung protectively around her stuffed rabbit. Her hair was a messy halo against the pillow, and for a moment Daniel simply watched her, letting the sight anchor him. 5 years old. Too young to understand how much strength she gave him just by existing. He rubbed his eyes and sat up, his shoulders already tight with responsibility. Today mattered. Not in a dramatic, fireworks sort of way, but in the quiet, adult way where one decision or outcome could ripple through the rest of their lives. 2 years earlier, mornings had looked different. Emily used to wake before him, humming softly as she moved through their apartment, her voice a gentle soundtrack to the start of the day. She had a laugh that filled rooms and a way of making ordinary moments feel important. Then there had been the hospital. The smell of antiseptic. The way time had warped as doctors spoke in careful, measured sentences. Emily's heart condition, rare, aggressive, cruel, had taken her while Sophie slept in a plastic bassinet down the hall. Daniel had learned in that moment what it meant to keep breathing even when the world told you not to. Since then, life had narrowed into essentials: work, childcare, bills, love, survival. The trip they were returning from was no vacation. Daniel had flown across the country for a final interview with a medical software company specializing in patient monitoring systems designed to prevent deaths like Emily S. The irony had been sharp enough to sting, but he'd pushed through it. When the CEO herself had called to offer him the job, Daniel had sat in stunned silence while Sophie colored at the hotel desk. "We'd like to upgrade your return flight," the woman had said gently. "You've earned some rest." Daniel had almost declined. Almost, pride had always been expensive. But Sophie had yawned, and reality had won. Now he stood and moved quietly, preparing for the day. He packed their bags with practiced efficiency, laid out Sophie's clothes, and finally crouched beside her bed. "Hey, Starshine," he whispered. Sophie stirred, then smiled, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "Are we going home?" she asked. He said, "We're flying home today." Her smile widened instantly. "Can I sit by the window again?" He laughed softly. "You always do." At the airport, Daniel moved with calm focus, Sophie's small hand tucked securely in his. He felt the familiar glances, some curious, some judgmental, some sympathetic. A single father traveling alone with a child always seemed to disrupt expectations. He didn't mind anymore. Survival had thickened his skin. When they boarded, the quiet elegance of the first-class cabin surprised Sophie into silence. "Daddy," she whispered, her eyes wide. "It looks fancy." Daniel smiled, his heart tight. "Just seats, sweetheart." But even he felt the difference. Space, calm, a rare absence of chaos. For one fragile moment, Daniel allowed himself to believe that life might finally be easing its grip. He didn't know yet how quickly that peace would be challenged. The flight attendant, a woman named Chloe with kind eyes and a warm smile, offered them orange juice in real glasses. Sophie held hers like a precious treasure, her small finger tracing the rim. "Look, Daddy, a real glass." Daniel's heart ached with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. This simple luxury was a world away from the plastic cups and cramped spaces they were used to. As the plane taxied and then soared into the air, Sophie pressed her face against the window, mesmerized by the shrinking world below. Daniel leaned back, the leather seat a small comfort against his weary back. He let his eyes drift shut, allowing the gentle hum of the engines to lull him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a sliver of hope, a new job. A fresh start. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally looking up. An hour into the flight, a sudden, jarring jolt shook the cabin. Daniel's eyes snapped open. Sophie let out a small gasp, her hand flying to his arm. The seatbelt sign pinged on, its chime sharp and insistent. A voice, tight with forced calm, came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've hit some unexpected turbulence. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts securely fastened." Daniel's practice calm kicked in. "It's okay, Starshine," he said, his voice steady as he squeezed her hand. "Just some bumps in the road like when we drive over a bumpy street." Sophie nodded, her big eyes fixed on his. But this wasn't a bumpy street. The plane dipped again, more violently this time. A few overhead bins popped open. In that terrifying moment, Daniel wasn't a professional or a passenger. He was just a father. He looked down at Sophie, her small body trembling in his arms. He saw Emily's eyes in hers, Emily's smile. All his sacrifices, all his struggles, it had all been for her. To give her a life his wife would have been proud of. He held her tighter, whispering in her ear, "I love you, Sophie. I love you so much. It's going to be okay." He didn't know if it was true, but it was all he had left to give her. He could hear moans and cries around him, a symphony of suffering. But all he could focus on was the small, still form in his lap. "Sophie?" he rasped, his voice raw. "Starshine, can you hear me?" There was no response. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. He fumbled with his free hand, his fingers searching for a pulse on her neck. He found it, faint, but there. She was alive. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost made him pass out, washed over him. He had to get her out. He twisted his body. "Get her as far away from the fuselage as you can. Medics are coming?" Daniel staggered out of a gaping hole in the side of the plane and into a chaotic, surreal landscape. The aircraft had torn apart in a dense forest. Wreckage was scattered everywhere. Survivors were huddled together, some dazed, some crying, some trying to help the injured. He carried Sophie to a clearing, away from the immediate danger of the smoldering plane. He laid her down gently on a patch of soft moss, using his jacket as a pillow. He tore a strip from his shirt and pressed it gently against the cut on her head. Because in the end, that was all that ever truly mattered. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more content like this. We appreciate your support. The sound of Megan's knees hitting the carpeted aisle of the airplane was impossibly loud. A collective gasp rippled through the first-class cabin. Passengers who had just been settling in now turned to stare. At the center of it all was Megan, a flight attendant, kneeling before a man named Daniel and his young daughter Sophie. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice, usually so crisp and professional, broke with emotion. "I judged you. I was wrong." Daniel's immediate instinct was to recoil, not from anger, but from a profound sense of discomfort. This public display of penance wasn't what he wanted. It wasn't what he had ever asked for. He looked down at the woman, her uniform now creased by her position on the floor, and saw not a triumphant moment, but a deeply human one. Just a few minutes ago, the scene had been entirely different. Daniel and Sophie had made their way onto the plane. Their backpacks a little worn, their clothes comfortable but simple. They held tickets for first class, a rare and hard-earned treat. Daniel's wife, Emily, had passed away a year ago, and this trip was meant to be a special memory for him and Sophie, a way to find a little light in the shadow of their grief. He had worked tirelessly, saving every extra penny to make this happen, to give his daughter a taste of a world beyond their quiet, modest life. But as they entered the first-class cabin, they were met with a wall of quiet judgment. The other passengers, in their tailored suits and designer bags, gave them quick, dismissive glances. And then there was Megan. She had stopped them with a practiced, tight smile. "Excuse me, sir," she'd said, her tone dripping with polite condescension. "I believe your seats are in the economy cabin. This section is reserved." Daniel had calmly shown her their boarding passes. He saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes, quickly masked by a professional veneer. "Oh," she'd said, her voice flat. "My mistake, right this way," but the damage was done. The implication hung in the air. "You don't belong here." Sophie had squeezed his hand, her small face clouded with confusion and a hint of shame. Daniel had felt a familiar sting, a quiet ache he'd known many times before. It was the feeling of being measured and found wanting, not for who he was, but for what others assumed he was. He had said nothing. He simply led Sophie to their seats, helped her buckle in, and tried to push the incident aside. He was here for his daughter, not to fight battles with strangers. But another flight attendant, an older woman with kind eyes, had witnessed the exchange. She had approached her colleague, Megan, and spoken to her in a low, firm voice. What she said Daniel couldn't hear, but he saw Megan's face pale. He saw her composure crumble. And now, here she was, kneeling in the aisle. "I saw a tired man with a child," Megan continued, tears now freely falling down her cheeks, tracing paths through her makeup. "And I decided you didn't belong. I made an assumption based on nothing. I forgot my purpose. I forgot that my job is to serve, not to judge." Sophie, who had been watching silently from her seat, tightened her grip on Daniel's fingers. She was too young to fully grasp the complexities of the situation, but she understood humility. She understood sadness. Daniel looked at his daughter, then back at Megan. This spectacle was making everyone uncomfortable, turning a private moment of prejudice into a public performance of remorse. "Please," Daniel said, his voice gentle but firm. "Get up. You don't need to do this." Megan shook her head, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I do," she whispered. "I need to do this. I need you to know how wrong I was." In that moment, Daniel thought of Emily. He thought of all the times they had faced similar quiet indignities together. The times they were followed in stores, the times they were spoken down to, the times their presence was questioned in spaces where they had every right to be. They had always handled it with quiet grace, protecting each other and their dignity without making a scene. Dignity, he realized, wasn't something you demanded with a loud voice. It was something you carried within you, something that could be quietly stripped away by 1,000 tiny cuts. He looked at Megan, truly looked at her, and saw not just a flight attendant who had made a mistake, but a person grappling with a profound failure of her own character. Her apology wasn't just for him, it was for herself. It was a confrontation with a part of herself she was ashamed of. He took a slow, deliberate breath. The anger he might have felt had long since dissipated, replaced by something heavier, more meaningful, resolve. "I accept your apology," he said, and his voice was calm and clear, cutting through the tense silence of the cabin. The other passengers leaned in, listening intently. "I accept it, but I want you to do something for me." "Remember this feeling?" Megan looked up, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. "Don't forget how this feels right now," Daniel continued. "The shame, the regret. Don't just apologize and move on. Let this feeling change you. The next time you see someone and your mind starts to create a story about them, who they are, where they belong, remember this moment. Remember kneeling on this floor. Let that be the thing that makes you choose kindness. Let it make you choose empathy instead of judgment." It wasn't a demand for punishment. It was a plea for growth. It wasn't about his victory or her defeat. It was about turning a moment of ugliness into a catalyst for something better. Megan nodded, unable to speak through her quiet sobs. She slowly, shakily, got to her feet. Without another word, she turned and stepped away, disappearing toward the galley. Just then, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and routine. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've received our final clearance from the tower. Cabin crew, please prepare for departure." The spell was broken. The other passengers shifted in their seats, murmuring amongst themselves. Some looked at Daniel with a newfound respect. Others seemed embarrassed, perhaps reflecting on their own initial judgments. The aisle was clear. The journey was about to begin. Daniel sat back in his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't the thumping of adrenaline from a confrontation one. It wasn't a feeling of victory. It was the steady, powerful beat of resolve. He looked out the window as the plane began to move, and then he looked at his daughter. Sophie gave him a small, uncertain smile. He smiled back, squeezing her hand. He hadn't set out to teach anyone a lesson. He had simply wanted to give his daughter a beautiful memory. But in the process, something more had happened. A moment of prejudice had been met not with anger, but with grace. A wound had been exposed not for revenge, but for healing. And in the quiet, pressurized cabin, 30,000 feet above the world, Daniel had held on to his dignity and, in doing so, had offered a path for someone else to reclaim their own. The trip was already more meaningful than he could have ever imagined. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more content that explores the depths of the human experience. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.